Property Podcast. I'm Simon, and I've been investing in property for over 20 years. And if you're an active landlord or planning your next property investment, this podcast is for you. I was planning to make this episode another news roundup, but I think there's only really one news item currently in town. The Renters' Rights Bill finally finished its journey through Parliament last week and has this week received royal assent, meaning it is officially law. So, what's in the Renters' Rights Act? And what does it mean for landlords? In future episodes, I will dig into some of the actual process changes that I think are introduced by this new law. But today, I'm going to run through a bit more of an overview. As it's actually all decided and final now, we don't need to speculate and can actually talk about details with certainty. Considering this law in one form or another has been being worked on for quite a few years now across a couple of governments, it has seen an awful lot of speculation over that time and quite a lot of changes in its journey, although an awful lot of it has actually stayed consistent from when it was first introduced by the Conservatives many years ago. But it is now absolutely certain, and hence we can talk about it a lot more clearly. Lots of the information I'm running through today is based on excellent work by Suzanne Smith, who has a website available at theindependentlandlord.com. There will, of course, be a link to that in the show notes as well. Suzanne has done a lot of hard work reading through the new law and has published many articles over the years and now that things are actually finalised. She also has videos going into a lot more detail as well. So if you want to hear perhaps more of the actual direct legal details from what I'm going into today, I do recommend you go and have a look at her site. First up, I think it's important to talk about when. Unfortunately, the Renters' Rights Act is finished and officially law, but that doesn't mean it's in full effect yet. And we don't know exactly when that is going to be still, sadly. The law does include what's referred to as a commencement date, which is when lots of the changes will actually kick in. The government, however, is still yet to define that date, or set that date, I should say, and it's up to them to do that. From reading through Suzanne's postings, her current guess is that it's likely to be during spring or summer next year, 2026. While we don't know exactly when, we do, of course, know what will be changing. And that is what we can actually talk about in a bit more detail today and in some future episodes as well. I think the biggest headline grabbing change has really been around sort of the removal of Section 21 as an option for eviction. But seeing as that isn't actually used very often and almost never without there actually being another underlying reason for that eviction, I don't think that will actually be a very big change for most landlords. And hence, I'm not going to dig into that or really cover it any more than what I've just said in this episode. There are, however, some very big changes though. This is not an exhaustive list that I'm going to cover today, but just a few that I think are particularly important and will be affecting landlords in their sort of day-to-day running of their properties. From the very start of the rental process, there is a change. And this is the ban on accepting higher rental bids. So this is going to be affecting you not really from setting up a tenancy, but before that, when you start advertising for new tenants. Currently, of course, rental property is advertised at sort of the expected rental level. And sometimes you might get multiple interested parties and end up accepting an offer slightly over what was advertised. You won't be able to do that after the commencement date. Once you advertise a rental price, you're effectively setting a cap on what you can legally accept as rent for that tenancy. I think this means we'll fairly quickly see advertised asking rents taking a little jump up, at least in higher demand areas anyway. And tenants will need to learn to start making offers under the asking rent if they think that might be accepted. Landlords and agents will then, within reason, accept the highest of the bids up to the maximum of the asking rent. However, there is a potential catch. If agents and landlords get too carried away with what they might be asking and then accepting sort of an outlier bid that's getting close to that, a new tenant can challenge the rent within the first 6 months of a tenancy, going to a free tribunal to potentially get it reduced to the market rent, however that's defined. So you might need to keep a record of other bids you receive in order to show that the rent you accepted was actually being presented by the market and not just an outlier, but it really was a representation of what could be achieved. The next pre-tenancy change is around accepting advanced rent. After the commencement date, you can't, basically. The maximum rental period will be 1 month, and you cannot accept any more than 1 month of rent in advance. This rules out anyone paying 6 months or 12 months in advance, which has been used by some tenants to sort of secure a tenancy and ensure that they can actually get to that tenancy, either as a sort of way of outbidding other tenants, or sometimes as a way to reassure the landlord that they can actually pay the rent, especially if they don't have any sort of background in the country or credit checks that can be done appropriately. It also rules out taking the last month of rent in advance, which some landlords do as an alternative to a deposit. Of course, this means you effectively have 2 months of rent paid in advance, which will no longer be permitted. There are also stricter rules around exactly when you can receive the first rent payment. Specifically, the tenancy agreement must be signed fully by all parties before you accept that rent payment. Then, moving on to the tenancy itself. The standard wording will of course be changing, but I think the biggest change we'll notice is that you can no longer start with a fixed period of 6 or 12 months. Currently, during this initial period, neither the tenant or landlord can give notice to end the tenancy, which of course gave a good level of security for both parties. After the commencement date, there will be no initial fixed periods. All tenancies will be a rolling monthly agreement right from the beginning. Notices to end the tenancy can be given from either side, albeit that most on the landlord side have quite long notice periods, right from that beginning point. On the tenant side, their notice period is set at 2 months. This is still expected to end on the last day of a rental period, as generally tenant notice periods are expected to currently. So it will actually mean that most notices given by tenants will be between 2 and 3 months. But that's still a lot shorter than 6 or 12 months that landlords would currently have that sort of initial security for. Of course, most tenants are renting a home and don't want to move again after 2 months. So again, most of the time, this won't actually have a real world effect. But the option existing seems to be making quite a lot of landlords nervous, especially student landlords. And this is where I think it could potentially be a problem and sort of change the market a bit. I'm expecting a lot of student markets to see some fairly major changes after the commencement date. I think they'll become a lot more like the professional HMO market and generally a lot less tied to the academic calendar. It won't be possible to agree tenancies so far in advance. So quite often they're 9 months or even getting on for 12 months that student tenancies get agreed and signed in advance currently. And I don't believe that's possible after the commencement date. And that means they will be agreed much closer to the time. And then also there will be a bit more in-year adjustment for these tenancies as well. So both with people leaving, but also meaning that rooms are available and advertised mid-year, because landlords aren't going to want to leave them empty, so they may as well advertise them. And I suspect that means there will be a bit more moving around, and there will be people taking up those mid-year rooms that become vacant, at least to some extent. I think it'll be very interesting to see how much that extent is and how much those vacancies can be filled, or whether that will turn out to be a real problem for the student market. Next up, I'm going to give a very quick mention to the Landlord Ombudsman and the PRS database, both of which all landlords will need to register with. But that's about all I'm going to say about that for the moment. The other really big change I want to include today is around penalties. These are getting much, much harsher for landlords who get things wrong. Almost everything you might get wrong now comes with a fine. And these fines generally start in the thousands of pounds range. And what more, they go up to tens of thousands of pounds. That might be for certain things being wrong, or more commonly for repeat sort of occurrences of things being wrong. Plus, though, some failures can lead to rent repayment orders. Of course, these have existed already for a while, but there are extra cases that can now lead to these rent repayments. And of course, in some cases, there might be fines and rent repayment orders. I expect councils, tenants, and courts generally to get much hotter on finding and enforcing these assorted landlord failures. So as a landlord, you will need to make sure you've got your processes really sorted and that you're really properly on top of your paperwork and making sure you don't fall foul of any of the new rules, or indeed lots of existing rules. You will also need to make sure that you really trust your agent if you use one, as many failures could cost you money as a landlord, even if it's your agent who messes up. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to end on that slightly scary warning for this week. Future episodes will cover other changes and many more details on these topics as well. You don't need to panic just yet, though. But if you want to get ahead and start reading a bit more, get yourself a bit more aware of some of the details and some of the other things I haven't been able to cover on this week's episode, there will, of course, be a link to Suzanne's website in the show notes, and I do recommend going and having a read. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again for the latest market stats and data.